Hi, I'm Erik Jones, and you're listening to Verse by Verse. The first 5 books of the Old Testament are known as the Law, or the Torah in Hebrew. In addition to historical narrative, they contain the law God gave to His people. These laws are found throughout the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Of those 5 books, the final one, Deuteronomy, is unique because it is essentially a retelling or a review of the law. The setting of Deuteronomy is the end of Israel's 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. As they were preparing to enter the Promised Land, Moses gathered that generation together and reviewed the law and the covenant that their fathers and mothers had agreed to 40 years earlier. Some might ask, what's the need to pay attention to Deuteronomy if it's just Moses reviewing the laws that are already covered in the earlier books? It's a fair question, but there is a good answer. Deuteronomy is important because there are important nuances and details that Moses gives in Deuteronomy that add depth to the original telling of the law in the earlier books. Moses' additions and rewordings don't make Deuteronomy's version completely original or different, not at all, but he did add nuance and elaborations that amplified and enhanced the earlier versions. Consider that Moses had 40 years to study and reflect on the laws of God, so his explanations of those laws in Deuteronomy reflect a man who understood the application and intent much better than he did when he first received them 40 years earlier. Also, he was speaking to a group of people who were making the transition from nomadic wanderers to a settled nation. So in Deuteronomy, he often puts the laws in terms that would more directly apply to the people in this new setting. With that as background, in this episode we'll focus on one specific law and the small details Moses added in his retelling of it in Deuteronomy. That law is the 4th commandment. As Exodus describes it, the commandment to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Let's examine what nuanced details Moses added in his retelling of that command in Deuteronomy. Remember, looking at these 2 versions should be an exercise in the principle of addition. The differences add to what we read in Exodus. They don't detract or change it. So let's look at Deuteronomy 5, verse 12. Due to time limitations, I can't read every word of Deuteronomy 5, verses 12 through 15, but I do encourage you to look it up in your own Bible and read along as I comment on it. Starting in verse 12, the first main difference we note is that instead of saying, remember the Sabbath, as Exodus records it, Deuteronomy tells us to observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Where Exodus focuses on not neglecting or forgetting about the Sabbath, Deuteronomy focuses on preserving and protecting it. It emphasizes that we are to guard it by being diligent to rest and treat it holy. So by putting these 2 together, to keep the Sabbath properly, we must first never forget it, and then we must also treat it as holy and special by protecting it, guarding it as something very precious. Moving on to Deuteronomy 5, verse 14, we see another nuance of difference. In verse 14, Moses elaborates on the purpose for making sure servants, or we could say employees, were to be given the Sabbath as a rest day as well. He adds this that Exodus 20 doesn't mention, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. By adding this, he's emphasizing the universality of the Sabbath. It wasn't just for landowners, the wealthy, or even just Israelites. It was for everyone. The Israelites were to be diligent to make sure that not only their animals, but also their servants were given the opportunity to observe and rest on the Sabbath. Within the nation of Israel, the Sabbath was to be observed from the top to the bottom of society. It was to be ingrained into the entire fabric of their nation and culture. Now let's look at the final major difference between Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. That's found in Deuteronomy 5, verse 15. Whereas in Exodus 20, verse 11, the people were reminded that the Sabbath points back to the fact that God rested after creation, Deuteronomy 5, verse 15 emphasizes how the Sabbath would also remind them of the rest they were given from the bondage in Egypt. It reads, "And remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." So they were also to remember that God was not just their creator, as Exodus points out, but also their liberator, the one who gave them rest from the bondage of slavery. This lesson continues to be important today. When Christians keep the Sabbath, they reflect on the rest God gave them by liberating them from the sinful world around them and by taking away the burden of the penalty of sin, which is death. But even more than that, they also reflect on the future rest of the kingdom of God, the ultimate promised land, eternal rest. The Sabbath points to the past, God as creator and God as liberator from bondage. It points to the present, our current freedom from sin and its bondage. And it points to the future, the eternal rest of the kingdom of God, the true promised land. We learn much more about the depth and the meaning of the Sabbath command by unifying Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 together. Friends, this episode just skimmed the surface of a huge topic. This comparison between the Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 versions of the fourth commandment is just a sample of the depth there is to learn about the Sabbath and God's other laws. To learn more about God's Sabbath, download our free booklet on the Sabbath in the show notes. It will add many more insights to help you fully grasp and obey the command found in Exodus and Deuteronomy to remember and observe the Sabbath to keep it holy.
Verse by Verse is a companion podcast to the Daily Bible Verse blog, which you can find on the Life, Hope, and Truth Learning Center. Check out the show notes for more.